Why go looking for culture? Culture is an old problem in the social sciences, and this film describes why thinking about it still matters. And to do it, we are looking at a place many people regard as a cultural joke, a cultural desert, Milton Keynes.
Never seen anywhere like it. Central Milton Keynes. You've never been anywhere like it. Central Milton Keynes. You've never seen shopping as it should be until you've been to Central Milton Keynes.
In looking at Milton Keynes, the attraction for me is partly about the perversity of looking for culture in a place that's not reputed to have any. But yet, if you scrape away easy assumptions about what kind of a place it is, you actually find something deeply paradoxical, deeply strange, and there is something that gets to the heart of something strange underneath the very familiar notions about concrete, about roundabouts, about lacking any history or any soul. There actually is a very interesting, perplexing soul here. And I really like the idea of saying, well, actually, this is the perfect place to test your ideas about what culture is. What is culture? We talk about it as somewhere like a tourist board might use it to say, come here if you want to have a cultural experience, to talk about art galleries, to talk about opera, to talk about theatre. But at the same time, culture turns up in corporate culture. Will you fit with the organisation's culture? How do you transform the organisation's culture? So what is culture? Is it something between this elite pursuit of truth and beauty, which is the traditional idea of it? Or is it in fact a much more complicated business which is involved with thinking about meanings, representations and lived experience?
Stuart Hall, former professor of sociology at the Open University, saw this. Looking for culture means watching it disappear. Culture is permanently displaced. It is everywhere, which is not the same as being nowhere, but sometimes seems like it. Culture is not like the state, politics, or the economy. It runs through them. Culture is the condition which gives us an understanding of them. This is what makes it important to look for culture through economy, through politics, through places.
The Cultural Studies project did do a lot to establish that culture was not just the pursuits of the elites. It was actually present in all sorts of everyday experiences, ways of life. So going to the dog racing, eating fish and chips, these things are recognised as being cultural. That was an important move, but it had a certain consequence. That move also introduced a situation where culture is in every form of practice, culture is in every form of experience. So how do you find it? How do you define what you're talking about? And this is a key intellectual problem. And that is the challenge of it, but it's also the reason to go looking for it. So what can culture do in terms of making sense of what are the meanings people attach to doing things like going to Nando's, going shopping, skateboarding, whatever it is that they do in their free time or in their work time, how do they make sense of it? And that's where culture is.
Culture is a process sustained across several linked stages: representation, identification, production, consumption, regulation. It seems to me the presence of meaning in each of the stages of the circuit which defines its cultural character.
I use the term culture to refer to the shared meanings in a community which enable people to make sense of the world in roughly the same ways and to organize a kind of cultural life together.
There are also discursive practices within meaning, and it's this dimension which makes them distinctively cultural.
Looking for culture means trying to figure out how different dimensions of human experience come together. The conjunctures, the dynamic articulation between culture, politics, and history.
We wanted to start really revisiting that question at this particular historical moment, because culture seems to be useful to think about, well, how did all these things happen that defy rational, political, economic explanation in very simple ways?
It was this kind of late 20th century thinking about the role of culture across all dimensions of human experience that became known as the cultural turn. By the early 2000s, the idea that something called culture was critical to understanding and intervening in economic and organisational life was well established. So the idea that economies, markets, organisations were amenable, were available to cultural analytical description, that were constituted through such descriptions, was the intellectual backdrop against which the Journal of Cultural Economy was set up in 2008.
Economics says that people behave rationally. Anyone who watches them shop, a deeply cultural experience, knows they don't behave rationally. How do we place culture? How do we make sense of it? Is it determined by the economy? Does it float free of the economy? There was a kind of turning away from that. This was round about the time that we started planning for the first edition of the Journal of Cultural Economy, and our authors and our readers didn't seem to be particularly preoccupied by the problem of culture itself. So the journal's early issues are dominated by all sorts of different kinds of turn, not the cultural turn.
Around 2010, the major turn in the social sciences was towards big data. But data, algorithms and analytics failed to predict Brexit and failed to predict the election of Trump. The rise of populist nationalism, mistrust of experts and post-factual politics has turned attention back to people, what they think and what they say.
What do people say? What do people mean? And how do you address people who have felt like they've been silenced? Public atmospheres of sentiment. Returning to culture as a way of trying to think about, well, how do we get at these things that are so difficult? We can't explore them purely through material, technical descriptions, and we can't explore them through grand narrative, logical discussions about how societies operate. We have to explore them through these conjunctures and cosmologies of how culture circulates in the world.
Culture matters in shaping how political and economic events unfold. But the big question is whether we have thought hard enough about this since the first bloom of cultural studies. And there's not a simple answer to that. So what about looking for culture through a place that is bidding to be a European capital of culture? Milton Keynes is built on a curving grid system of roads that link and separate the different local places within it. The vision was utopian, a forest city, a place of mixtures, green and glass, air and land, medieval and modern, neoliberal and pagan, ancient coaching routes and algorithmic data trails that lead all the way back to Bletchley Park. These strange mixtures betray something about culture and economy. They are always in it together.
Milton Keynes is so derided for lacking culture that even the Tourist Board have performed a semiotic switcheroo of using the claim that the place lacks culture in their advertising.
Paradox is familiar territory for Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes was a paradox from the start. The Milton Keynes Development Corporation had a vision of a planned utopia, but one that was to be practical, everyday, middling.
The notion of a practical utopia or an everyday utopia comes out of thinking about what the New Time movement might have been about. Both a utopian tradition, but also a very pragmatic tradition, utilitarian philosophy, nation of shopkeepers and so on. And I think that comes together when you think about the planning for somewhere like Milton Keynes in particular, which is quite deeply rooted both in a whole series of ways of writing about it, thinking about it, imagining it by the planners who were involved, which is utopian or quasi-utopian, at the same time as they buy into quite a traditional notion of what everybody wants, which is low-rise housing with gardens and so on.
Milton Keynes's grid system on first glance echoes North American layouts. Some of the streets are even numbered. But Milton Keynes's grid is a wonky grid, and that was quite deliberate. The grid was designed to curve around what was there already. It sweeps around the topographies. You very quickly encounter the fact that this is a city in a forest. This is a city that's immediate presentation is so green, so wooded, that sometimes people drive right through it and miss it entirely. It's a very appropriated, quite English version of the modernist grid. It's learned from some of the constraints that modernist, straight, rational grids impose to allow more space for people and plants and trees and water to move and to live.
Planning Milton Keynes drew from the modernist projects that inspired the great metropolises, but wanted to avoid their problems, to provide for the modest hope of honest labour and decent low-rise living.
If we were wanting a specific case to look at within Milton Keynes, Netherfield gives us lots to talk about. It's one of the earliest estates to have been built. The estate had rave reviews in the architectural press when it was built, but then it very quickly turned into a place that wasn't working, people didn't want to live there, and had a reputation for being a sink estate.
So the architects set out to build a utopian idealised space that you could come and live in, and it was very practical and rational. And there would be green space and fields outside that you could send your kids to play in.
And everybody would be equal. All the houses looked the same, just like Georgian terraces.
That was the vision for Netherfield. But the vision for Milton Keynes was also there'd be equal numbers of houses for rent and houses to buy. And although Netherfield was supposed to reflect that mix, it was eventually decided that because of the design of the estate, the cost of the land, it made them too expensive to buy. So Netherfield was rental only, and its fairly fast turnover of tenants didn't help to create or maintain that kind of bourgeois community that was imagined by the architects.
The other issue was that the fact that the houses were built really quickly. The facades blew off, the roofs were leaking, the floors were spongy, bouncy. Fred Roach would come out in the middle of the night to see if they were still standing, according to his wife. And so the estate got a reputation.
According to the Office of National Statistics, Milton Keynes is one of the most well-off areas outside of London. But at the same time, Netherfield is also one of the 1% most deprived areas in the country. So we go from this perfectly valid, plausible vision of a decent place to live to a number on a screen on a government website which says something's going wrong here.
The culture of the corporation, the culture of the city, and the culture of the architectural environment that the city was being built in, all of these things contribute together, backwards and forwards, trying to get this thing to happen, but not quite being able to resolve it. And I think that lack of resolution probably carries through from that point. We talk about Margaret Thatcher and the whole thing changes. It might have been implicit in 1972, but come 1979, now it's explicitly conflicted between what you think is your cultural heritage and what's being imposed on you as some kind of capital coercion to adopt a different cultural heritage or to a different cultural legacy for the future.
The world turned in the 1970s, fundamentally turned. The end of that post-war social democratic period in Britain, the end of Keynesianism, glimpsing the end of the welfare state.
The history of places like Netherfield show that economic, political and architectural visions never stay pure when they are lived. Culture is experience lived, experience interpreted, experience defined.
Culture is present in how capital operates. Culture is present in how we value resources, how we value commerce. Culture is inherent to that operation, how culture circulates in the world and how culture circulates through things which seem as acultural as capital. Another ironic twist that leaves you in the position of saying, well, so if culture is in capital, capital is also in culture.
How do you use culture to guide you through capital? Why take a cultural approach to the process of capitalization?
What is capital? Capital can be defined as a sum of money that you can consider from different calculative angles. And this would be the answer given by an accountant or an economist that wants to criticize or justify several ways to consider capital, to measure it, to assess it. Capital can be this, but it can be also a way of looking at things. It can be a semiotic engine, like a prism, or even, why not, a sort of cosmology, a way that produces meaning, in a sense, a way to signify things. So to capitalize something would be a way to signify this something is something in a particular way.
Capital is in fact a way of looking at the world and a way of looking at and measuring and valuing value.
Capital is the result of practices and shared ideas about where financial value will come from in the future, and that's cultural. And through another acrobatic manoeuvre of our history, culture is where capital is supposed to come from in the future.
One of the consequences of the cultural turn was that culture starts to be acknowledged and counted and accounted for. Attempts over the last 2 decades or more have been made to attach a financial and economic value to culture. And this, of course, is why places want to become capitals of culture, because they see this as a way of making more robust, more certain the financial and economic security of a place. Not just its cultural liveliness, but its cultural liveliness for its financial well-being.
If Milton Keynes wants to become a capital of culture, it's partly because culture brings capital. We just have to learn how to get it onto the balance sheet, measure it, account for it. And that brings you right back to the problem with culture.
We don't actually know what we value in culture anymore. Everything's interesting. High culture, low culture, from advertising to pop art to great art. It's all in a kind of mishmash now.
I think you're asking me, how can people live without, some sense that there's an ultimate truth or an ultimate scale of values? And I don't know, but I don't any longer think that this is just a transitional phase and that we're moving on to some other more settled period. I think, culturally we're in the kind of phase of permanent revolution.
Amen.